Look at your face in the mirror right now. Look at your nose. Not with shame, not with pride. Just look at it because nobody ever told you the full truth about what it actually is. That curve, that width, that shape you have been staring at your entire life, it is not random. It is not an accident. It is not something you simply inherited from your parents, the way you inherit a last name. Your nose is a message, a biological letter written across hundreds of thousands of years, and science has finally decoded what it says. Here's a question that nobody in your school, your family, or your social media feed ever seriously asked. Why do different people across different continents have fundamentally different nose shapes? Not slightly different, dramatically different. People from West Africa tend to have wide, broad nostrils with a wider nasal base. People from Northern Europe tend to have narrow, tall, high bridged noses. People from South Asia fall somewhere in between. People from East Asia carry their own distinct nasal architecture. And for most of recorded human history, the explanation given for this was either embarrassingly vague or dangerously wrong. Either people were told it was just genetics, which explained nothing, or worse, it was used as fuel for theories that had nothing to do with science and everything to do with prejudice. But here is where it gets interesting, because science, real science, has now delivered an answer so precise, so aired, and so unexpected that it forces you to completely reframe what you think you know about your own face. Researchers, measuring the noses of more than 2,600 participants from West Africa, South Asia, East Asia, and Northern Europe, found that people with wider nostrils were significantly more likely to have ancestors from hot, humid climates, while people with narrower nostrils were more likely to descend from cold and dry environments. Read that again. Your nose width is not cosmetic. It is climatic. It is a survival mechanism so ancient that it predates civilization, language, agriculture, and every empire that has ever risen and fallen on this planet. The shape of your nose was being sculpted by the environment long before your ancestors had names. And that is just the beginning of this story. Think about what the nose actually does. Most people think of it as a breathing passage and a smell detector. But what most people are not seeing is that the nose is, at its functional core, an air conditioning system. Before any air reaches your lungs, your nose has already begun modifying it. It warms it, it moistens it, it filters it. And the architecture of that system, how wide the nostrils are, how high the bridge sits, how the air flows through, matters enormously for how efficiently that conditioning happens. Air that is already hot and humid does not need much modification before reaching the lungs, but cool, dry air must be warmed and moistened rapidly. And narrower nostrils create more turbulent airflow, forcing the air into greater contact with the warm, moist interior lining of the nasal cavity. This is engineering. Ancient, a biological engineering that your body inherited and that science spent decades trying to prove with data rather than just theory. And this is where everything changes, because the proof, when it finally came, was not simply observational. Scientists did not just look at people and make educated guesses. Researchers tested whether the spatial distribution of nose-shaped traits across global populations was correlated with mean annual temperature and humidity. The results showed that nostril width is strongly correlated with both temperature and absolute humidity. This was a landmark confirmation of what had been speculated since the 1800s, but now expressed in the hard language of genomics and population biology. The correlation was not weak, it was not suggestive. It was statistically significant in a way that ruled out random chance as an explanation. Something real was happening, something evolutionary. And the deeper scientists looked, the more extraordinary the picture became. The nose has had a complex evolutionary history, and researchers noted that an important function of the nose and nasal cavity is to condition inspired air before it reaches the lower respiratory tract. What this means, practically, is that your body's respiratory survival in a specific climate was partly dependent on the shape of your nose. In populations that lived for tens of thousands of years in equatorial Africa, where the air was perpetually warm and thick with moisture, a broader nasal opening allowed more air to be inhaled with less effort. There was no need to narrow the passage to add warmth or humidity because the environment was already providing those conditions. The broad nose was not a deficiency in this environment. It was an optimization, a precision adaptation so finely calibrated to its climate that the populations who carried it thrived generation after generation. But here is where it gets worse, or rather, more complicated. Not all of the variation scientists observed could be explained by climate alone. While some aspects of nose shape appear to have been driven by local climate adaptation, researchers concluded that this is a simplified explanation of a very complex evolutionary history, which possibly also involved other non-neutral forces such as sexual selection. In other words, who our ancestors found attractive? also played a role in shaping our faces. The nose you carry today is a product of survival pressures, yes, but also of desire, of the mates your ancestors chose, the preferences that rippled forward through generations, the subtle biases of attraction that operated invisibly across millennia. Your face is the result of an ancient conversation between environment and desire, between necessity and beauty, written in the code of DNA and carried forward to the moment you are reading these words. But the real story, the one that goes deeper than climate and deeper than attraction, lives inside the genome itself, because science did not stop at correlations. Scientists went into the DNA and started identifying the exact genetic switches that build your nose during development in the womb. And what they found was a molecular mechanism of stunning precision. Research indicates that certain genes, such as DCHS2, RUNX2, GLI3, and PAX1, influence specific nasal traits like width, bridge height, and tip shape. GLI3 and PAX1 are linked to nostril breadth, while RUNX2 affects the width of the nose bridge. DCHS2 influences the pointiness and projection of the nose. These are not general face genes. These are targeted, specific regulators of nasal architecture, each one controlling a different dimension of what your nose ultimately looks like when it finishes forming in the womb. Think about what that means. There is a gene, GLI3, that specifically controls how wide your nostrils are. There's another gene, RUNX2, that controls how wide your nose bridge sits. There is DCHS2, sitting on chromosome 4, that determines how pointed or flat your nose tip is and how far your nose projects from your face. And then there's PAX1, influencing the shape of your nostrils. Each of these genes contains variants, slightly different versions, that produce slightly different outcomes. The combination of variants you inherited determines, with remarkable specificity, the nose that appears on your face. This is not vague biological inheritance. This is a blueprint, a detailed architectural plan executed in the womb by molecular machinery that has been refined across hundreds of thousands of years of human evolution. GLI3, DCHS2, and RUNX2 are known to show strong signals of recent selection in modern humans compared to archaic humans, such as Neanderthals and Denisovans, with GLI3 in particular undergoing rapid evolution. Rapid. That is a word that rarely appears in evolutionary biology, because evolution on the genetic level is usually an imperceptibly slow process. When a gene shows a rapid rate of change, it means selection pressure was strong. It means the environment was powerfully rewarding certain versions of this gene and powerfully punishing others. It means nose shape was not trivial to your ancestors' survival. It was significant enough for natural selection to actively accelerate the evolution of the very genes that build it. And this is where the story takes its most astonishing turn. Because in 2023, a team of researchers, led by scientists from University College London, published a study in the journal Communications Biology that revealed something that nobody expected. Something that connects your nose, not just to your ancestors in Africa or Asia or Europe, but to an entirely different species of human that vanished from the Earth approximately 40,000 years ago. Humans inherited genetic material from Neanderthals that affects the shape of our noses. A study in communications biology found that a particular gene, which leads to a taller nose measured from top to bottom, may have been the product of natural selection as ancient humans adapted to colder climates after leaving Africa. The Neanderthals, the species we were taught to think of as primitive cousins who died out and left nothing behind. Except they did leave something behind, they left it inside us. According to informed sources in the field of paleogenomics, the discovery that modern humans carry Neanderthal LDNA is not new. It has been known since the first Neanderthal genome was sequenced in 2010, a breakthrough that earned Svante Pääbo the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2022. But what the 2023 study revealed was that this ancient inherited DNA specifically influences the structure of the human nose. In one particular genome region called ATF3, many people in the study with Native American ancestry had genetic material in this gene that was inherited from the Neanderthals, contributing to increased nasal height. This gene region has signs of natural selection, suggesting that it conferred an advantage for those carrying the genetic material. Natural selection retained it. That means it was useful. That means when ancient Homo sapiens migrated out of Africa into the colder, drier environments of Eurasia and eventually the Americas, the Neanderthal variant in the ATF3 region provided a survival advantage precise enough for selection to keep it in the gene pool rather than allowing it to fade. The researchers working on this study examined more than 6,000 Latin Americans, a population that is genetically admixed, meaning they carry ancestry from multiple ancient populations. Streams including indigenous Americans, Europeans, and West Africans. This admixture made them an extraordinary scientific lens, because in a mixed population, you can observe the effects of individual genetic variants against a rich and varied background. And what the researchers found was that the chromosome region 1q32.3, the region containing the Neanderthal introgressed DNA, was the single strongest genetic signal for nasal height in the entire study. The novel region in 1q32.3 shows introgression from Neanderthals, and the introgressed tract increases nasal height, consistent with the differentiation between Neanderthals and modern humans. Neanderthals were known from skull fossils to have markedly taller noses than modern humans. And now science has confirmed that some modern humans still carry a piece of that Neanderthal nasal architecture dormant in their DNA, passed forward through tens of thousands of years of interbreeding, migration, and survival. But here is where it gets worse, or rather, where the story becomes even more layered. Because the question that naturally emerges from all of this is, why did ancient Homo sapiens interbreed with Neanderthals at all? And the answer, according to the current understanding in paleogenomics, is simply proximity and time. When modern humans left Africa approximately 60,000 to 70,000 years ago and entered the territories where Neanderthals had been living for hundreds of thousands of years, they did not wage immediate and total war. They lived alongside them, they encountered them, and sometimes they reproduced with them. The genetic traces of those encounters are still present in the genomes of most non-African modern humans today, typically representing somewhere between 1 and 4% of total DNA. That number sounds small, but when you consider what those scattered percentages contain, immune system variants, metabolic adaptations, cold weather responses, and yes, nasal architecture, they stop sounding small, they start sounding consequential. What most people are not seeing is that this is not just a story about nose shape, this is a story about survival strategy. When modern humans moved into new, harsher climates, they had two available mechanisms for adaptation. They could wait for random mutations to slowly evolve new traits across thousands of generations, or they could acquire already evolved traits from a species that had been living in those harsh environments for far longer. Neanderthals had occupied cold Eurasia for approximately 300,000 to 400,000 years before modern humans arrived. They had already solved, at the genetic level, many of the problems that Homo sapiens was just beginning to face. The interbreeding that occurred was not just an accident of cohabitation. From an evolutionary standpoint, it was a shortcut. Modern humans borrowed evolutionary solutions from Neanderthals that would have taken thousands of years to develop independently, and the nose was one of those solutions. It has long been speculated that the shape of our noses is determined by natural selection, as our noses can help us regulate the temperature and humidity of the air we breathe in, and different shaped noses may be better suited to different climates that our ancestors lived in. The Neanderthal variant that increases nasal height was likely adaptive in cold, dry climates, precisely because a taller nasal passage increases the internal surface area available to warm and humidify incoming air. A broader, flatter nose optimized for hot, humid Africa becomes a liability in the cold, dry air of Ice Age Europe. A taller, narrower nasal passage that the Neanderthals had already evolved over hundreds of thousands of years in exactly those conditions suddenly becomes an enormous advantage. And so, when ancient humans who carried the Neanderthal variant in ATF3 entered cold environments, they survived more efficiently, reproduced more successfully, and passed that variant forward. Now zoom out. Because the picture that emerges from all of this research, the climate correlation studies, the genome-wide association scans, the Neanderthal introgression findings, is not a simple one. It is a picture of extraordinary complexity. Your nose is not the product of one force. It is the product of several overlapping forces operating simultaneously across different timescales. There is the ancient force of climate adaptation, which began shaping nasal width across African populations hundreds of thousands of years ago. Okay? There is the force of sexual selection, which added an additional layer of preference-driven change that scientists are still working to fully understand. There is the force of random genetic drift, the statistical reality that small populations carrying certain gene variants can become isolated and amplify those variants through sheer demographic accident, regardless of their adaptive value. And layered over all of this is the extraordinary wildcard of interspecies gene flow, the Neanderthal contribution that arrived not through gradual evolution, but through actual interbreeding between two distinct human species. These genetic traits are often inherited and reflect adaptations to ancestral climates and environments, meaning nasal morphology varies significantly across different ethnic groups. The variation you see in nose shapes across the world today is not a hierarchy. It is not evidence of superiority or inferiority. It is a catalog of solutions. Each nose shape is an answer to a question that a specific environment was asking of a specific population over a specific time period. The broad nose of West African ancestry is an answer to the question, How do you breathe most efficiently in hot, humid, equatorial air for tens of thousands of years? The narrow, high, bridged nose of Northern European ancestry is an answer to the question, how do you warm and humidify extremely cold and extremely dry air while minimizing heat loss from the respiratory tract? These are different answers to different questions, and both answers are correct in their respective contexts. About 75% of facial shape variation is heritable, with multiple genes such as PACS3, SOX9, and DCHS2 playing essential roles in determining key features like nasal shape, chin prominence, and jaw structure, orchestrating the growth and development of bone and cartilage. 75%. That number tells you that when you look at your nose in the mirror, most of what you see was predetermined in your DNA before you took your first breath. The environments your ancestors navigated, the climates they endured, the ancient populations they encountered and sometimes merged with, all of that is written in that 75%. The remaining 25% is where your lifetime of environmental exposures, your nutrition, your developmental history adds its own quiet signature. And here is what makes this science particularly powerful in the current moment. For most of human history, the differences in nose shape between populations were interpreted through the distorted lens of racial hierarchy. Broad noses were categorized as primitive. Narrow noses were presented as refined. This was not science. This was ideology wearing the costume of science. The actual science, the peer-reviewed, genome-level population biology science that has now been established through studies involving tens of thousands of participants across multiple continents, says something entirely different. It says that broad nostrils are a sophisticated evolutionary adaptation to specific climatic conditions. It says that the genes controlling nostril width show signs of active, positive natural selection, meaning that broad nostrils were so advantageous in their environment that evolution specifically promoted them. It says that far from being primitive, the broad nose represents one of humanity's most successful adaptive strategies, one precise enough that the genome itself was reshaped to produce it. The science also reveals something profound about what it means to carry these traits in a globalized world. Evolution takes time, enormous amounts of time. One scientist noted that if nose shape evolved in the past to adapt to local climate, it likely took tens of thousands of years. So descendants of Pakistani ancestry are likely still going to have wider noses even if they live in a colder climate, as long as they continue to marry others with similar ancestry. The adaptation is embedded in the DNA, not in any single lifetime. You cannot undo 70,000 years of climatic sculpting by moving to a different continent for 2 generations. The nose you carry is a document of deep time, and it will take deep time to change it, if it changes at all. What the research collectively suggests is that we are living in a strange moment in evolutionary history. For the first time, massive human migration and global mixing of populations is happening, on a timescale of decades rather than millennia. People whose ancestors evolved in equatorial Africa are now raising children in Scandinavia. People whose ancestors evolved in Northern Europe are building families in the tropics. The climatic pressures that sculpted these differences over hundreds of thousands of years no longer match the environments in which billions of their descendants now live. What happens to these traits across the next 10,000 years is a question that no scientist can currently answer with certainty. Evolution does not operate on a schedule that respects the pace of human civilization. But perhaps the most unsettling part of this entire story is not the science itself. It is what the science reveals about the questions we have never been willing to ask honestly. We look at faces every day. We form instant judgments. We carry aesthetic biases so deeply embedded in culture that we rarely notice them. And yet, underneath all of that, underneath the beauty standards and the social hierarchies and the centuries of distorted narratives, the actual structure of a human nose is the result of atmospheric pressure, ancestral geography, the humidity level of air that breathed through lungs that no longer exist, and the genetic legacy of a species that went extinct 40,000 years ago. The face you judge in a moment took 300,000 years to build. That realization should not be taken lightly. The deeper the genome-wide studies go, the more they reveal that human variation is not a ladder. It is a web. Every population on Earth carries unique genetic adaptations that solved unique environmental problems. Every nasal shape is a compressed record of challenges faced and survived. Most features of nose shape seem to be evolving neutrally across human populations, but dimensions related to the width of the nose appear to have differentiated more than would be expected under genetic drift, suggesting that at least some of the diversification in nose shape may indeed have been influenced by climate adaptation. And now the hard questions that remain. Is natural selection for nasal shape still actively occurring in human populations today? In the modern world, where climate controlled buildings, filtered air, and modern medicine have dramatically reduced the survival pressure of environmental adaptation, Are the old forces still pushing the genome in the same directions they always have? Or has modern civilization essentially paused that ancient engine, leaving us frozen in the evolutionary configurations our ancestors arrived at, no longer being sculpted by the pressures that created us? And what about the Neanderthal contribution? Scientists have now identified Neanderthal-derived genetic variants that influence immunity, metabolism, skin pigmentation, fat storage, and, yes, nasal architecture. But this is almost certainly not the complete list. The field of paleogenomics is still young. The tools for detecting ancient introgressed sequences in modern genomes are still being refined. There are almost certainly more Neanderthal-derived traits still waiting to be discovered in the human genome. Traits that are sitting in plain sight in the bodies of billions of people, completely unrecognized as the 40,000-year-old inheritance that they actually are. What else did we inherit from the species we replaced? What else is hiding in the genome, quietly shaping us in ways we have not yet had the tools to detect? These are not rhetorical questions. They are the active frontier of a field that is moving faster than at any point in its history. The sequencing technology that now allows scientists to read ancient genomes from fragments of bone tens of thousands of years old has only existed in its current form for about a decade. The genome-wide association studies that have mapped specific genes to specific nasal traits have only been conducted at meaningful scale in the last 10 years. The population-level climate correlation studies are even more recent. This science is in its infancy. What it has already revealed is extraordinary. What it has not yet revealed may be more extraordinary still. Your nose is a record, not just of your parents, not just of your grandparents, but of a journey that began on the African continent at least 300,000 years ago, and has never truly stopped. Every climate zone your ancestors passed through left a mark. Every environment they survived and rewarded certain genetic variants and quietly retired others. Every ancient encounter, including those with species that no longer exist, deposited something into the genome that still speaks, still expresses itself, still shapes the face that looks back at you in the mirror. The story written in your DNA is longer, more complex, and more astonishing than any story that has ever been told about you. And the scientists reading that story have barely reached the end of the first chapter.